And there's nothing you need me to do on the technical side?
Nope.
Great.
Once the recording ends, you might have to, it'll say like uploading, so just let it finish before you close the
Okay.
window. That's it. All right. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. This is Pride Month, June in 2026, and it's a great time to talk about mining and miner strikes. What in the world am I talking about? I am talking about a movie called Pride. Now, if you look for this movie, you'll probably find a whole bunch of Pride and Prejudice. You'll probably find a whole bunch of Netflix or Amazon's Pride collection. You might even find Simba's Pride, as my guest found. But there is a movie called Pride from 2011, made by the BBC. Fantastic movie that is about a that is about a pretty important event in queer history that very few people talk about. Lesbians and gays support the miners. And the BBC made a movie about it, and I have Becky Allen, returning guest, on to talk about it. And we want to talk about it today because this movie is about an important moment in queer history, but also in labor organizing history, and the way the movie tells the story about coalition building and about how do we see past our differences when we have common enemies, and just a whole bunch of the kind of themes that we love to talk about on this podcast. So, Becky, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me back.
Yeah.
For my quick introduction, my name is Becky Allen. I'm an author and a person who does online tech stuff for my day job. I live in New York. I live in a co-op, and so I have been discovering a lot of community and getting much more involved in my own community. I'm queer. I'm very excited to be discussing this movie. Yeah, and I feel like you probably had me on because the last labor movie we discussed, as far as I know, was Newsies, and that is also a fave of mine. I hadn't seen Pride before, so I watched it for this, and it is wonderful. I
Yeah.
really, really loved it.
Yeah. I'm so glad to hear that. And while many of us hope for some gay subtext in Newsies, this one, it is not subtext. It's much more upfront.
Yes. I don't know if you can hear me. I see you as frozen. It's possible that you see me as frozen. And if you can't hear me, I'm texting you.
Hey, okay. Sorry. Where did you lose me?
Oh, I think we were. I was just texting you that you were frozen. I think we were in the midst of saying
Okay. I'll do my
not
intro again.
gay instead of gay subtext is where we
Yeah.
were.
You're so right. I'm so glad that we brought up Newsies. Newsies is another great movie about the labor movement, as well as singing and dancing, which is another part of this movie as well. That movie, I think a number of people hope that there is a gay subtext possible. This one, it is, pretty clearly there. And just also further introducing myself, I'm Matthew. For those who haven't heard me before, I'm non-binary and queer. And so this movie is dear to my heart for those issues, but also because as someone who's been a community organizer for most of my life, some of that spent as a pastor, some of that spent in secular community organizing. My first job was as a union organizer. And I've always had a real fondness for the labor movement and a real sadness that, for a wealth of reasons that a lot of people have written about, a lot of the left and a lot of the labor movement have kind of parted ways. And so this story to me is such a beautiful one about queer community and labor community coming together in ways that still resonate today. And I want to talk about the movie, but I'm going to just very quickly tell the story of what actually happened. So in the mid 80s, a number of miners, people who work in coal mines, not kids, to be very clear, miners, a number of them, I think most of them in Great Britain, the United Kingdom, went on strike. Margaret Thatcher was doing a lot of terrible things to bust the unions. She and Reagan were kind of in the same vein, and this was right after Reagan had done terrible things to the air traffic controllers unions and the like. And during that time, the miners were really struggling. They were trying to pay the bills. They were trying to pay the rent and gas and put food on the table because they were on strike for almost a year. And led by this guy named Mark Ashton, a number of gays and lesbians in London decided to start raising money to support them. And he had this idea of like, look, Thatcher hates them, Thatcher hates us, we should be supporting them. He was a very left-wing socialist guy, and so he'd had a lot of support for labor unions already. And the movie tells a story about how they come to work together. And there's a lot of sort of fish out of water on both sides, and some tensions, but they come to work together. And one of the real points of the movie is that by the end of it, not only have the gays and lesbians all supported the miners, but that the miners remember that. And that long after the strike, the summer after that strike, at the Pride Parade, a huge number of coal miners came down to the Pride Parade and led the Pride Parade. And a couple of years later, when the Labor Party officially made gay rights a part of its platform, it was in large part because the miners, the mining union, the Labor Party at that point, each union was a big, big part of it, pushed very hard for it. And just to give you an idea that this isn't something that happened once and then went away, one of the characters in the movie is a guy named Mike Johnson. He's based on a real guy. Not long ago, for this year as part of Pride, Britain, like America, has had a real kind of right-wing turn. They don't have a Trump, but they certainly have a lot of the far right kind of movements, some of which are very anti-queer, including, unfortunately, some parts of the labor movement now. And the city council where this guy lived is run by Reform UK, which is a really right-wing party, and they voted to not give any city funds to support the Pride Parade that they'd supported for decades and decades. The miners' union, honoring this thing again from 40 years ago, heard about this, worked with Mike, and to donate more money to make this parade happen than had ever been donated to them before. So just a wonderful way of like this moment of coalition building kind of just kept going and kept being true. All right, I've said quite a lot. So Becky, let me kind of let you jump in, talk about what you like about this movie, what hit you.
Okay, so first off, the movie is lovely, and I definitely highly recommend it. I think it is too simplistic to say it's a feel-good movie or a feel-good story. There are a lot of elements of it, and I do think one thing we should touch on it at some point is that it is also situated in the midst of the AIDS crisis.
Yep.
And that is definitely a stated but still somewhat understated, I thought, element of it, and I really appreciated how that was acknowledged and handled within it without it becoming what the movie was about. But it is also very funny, and it is very uplifting. Like it is a lovely movie. It's not exactly a comedy. It's not exactly a drama, but it is a movie that makes you feel good by the end.
Yeah.
And I very much appreciated that, and it is something that I think is needed sometimes, just in terms of having queer stories, and particularly one that is based in history. Not all of the characters in the movie were real people, but many of them were. But it is something that I think is a really good and necessary thing to have, are stories that we can point to and say, even though bad things were happening, look at the community this built, look at the ways we're still feeling those echoes today. I got choked up reading about the Pride Parade this year. I got choked up when you were just describing it. And I think it's very powerful. And so first off, absolutely recommend the movie as something that is very powerful and will make you feel many feelings. But I do think that there's also, there's a lot to say about community. And I also think that at some point in this discussion, we should touch on respectability politics, because I think there are some interesting things happening there.
Definitely there is. And I think also I should note, both of us describe ourselves as queer. And I think this movie is also a reflection of a particular time and place. Yes. So if you're kind of wondering where's the B and the T in the description I used, that was just not the language that was used at that time. No one identifies as bisexual in the movie or describes themselves in that way. There are a number of not main characters, but sideline characters who are clearly either drag queens or trans or something like that. And so that's definitely a part of the community. But at the time, that was not the language people used. And so that's kind of one thing that is sort of, a historical artifact that it definitely threw me a little bit. But then when I did the research, it's like, no, this is just actually what, the name of the group was Lesbians and Gay Men Support the Miners. And I like what you said about the uplifting, because I think that's very right. Because, and here I'm going to give some spoilers, but it's also, these are historical facts that happened. The miners' strike was regarded by many people as a failure. And in many ways, I think that is both a sad but also hopeful part of the story, is that, the fact that the miners keep coming back and keep coming to support the queer community for many decades later now, after something, I think it definitely, like, I mean, the support that was given helped keep people alive, helped keep people moving. But the strike is remembered as a failure. It was remembered as one of the moments of Thatcher really crushing the labor union. And it's kind of, I think the way that the movie tells the story of naming that problem of, and reflecting that, and there being a moment of everyone kind of wondering, like, what was this for? What was the purpose of it? Really, to me, feels like a very important way that they ended on that high note of the parade, but also with the sad note of, like, yeah, this thing didn't work out the way that they wanted.
Yeah, I think that goes to show there is no end of history.
Yeah,
And that's something which I think certainly in the United States right now that we also need to keep very much in mind. Right now is a time of community building and coalition building because of all of the horrible things that are going on that we don't need to name right now.
yeah,
Um, and it is very easy to feel crushed by that. And
yeah,
there are a lot of things that you would look at and say individually, this is a thing that we lost. This is a thing that bad people won and we lost, and that's devastating. But you look at something like this and you can say, okay, there was a loss in this strike, and that is awful. And obviously, watching it as a narrative in a movie, you want them to win, and that's just not what happened.
yeah,
But you also see that was not the end of these people. They all went on to continue to do other things.
yeah,
Several of them passed away, but generally, like, the people continued to live and make progress. And the fact that they built this community between minors and queer people is something which continued to help both groups going forward, and they continued to have that solidarity and caring about each other. And that is, I wouldn't necessarily say more important than the actual, loss. Like, I don't think that that can be
yeah,
quantified in that way, but I think it's important to remember that the work that they did was not in vain, and that this alliance between very unlikely groups was not in vain, even though the strike did not have the desired outcome.
yeah. And I think that's such a good way of putting it. And especially one thing they talk about a lot in the movie is the way that these two very different groups are able to find the things they have in common. And in part, it starts with they have a common enemy, that Thatcher is going after both of them, that the police are going after both of them, that the press is going after both of them. And that becomes a thing. And one of my favorite lines in the movie, there's a guy named Cliff, who's one of the mining community, and someone is showing him, because one of the sort of plots of the movie is, will the miners support this, especially in the small town, because there's still a lot of, like, toxic masculinity and ideas about this, and when the miners are supposed to be strong, this make them look weak and all that. And someone is reading to Cliff from a newspaper about these terrible things about the gays and lesbians, and saying, how can you support them? And Cliff's response is, I read the terrible lies they tell us. Why would I believe the terrible lies they tell about them? And
Yeah.
I just thought that was such a great moment of, like, because to me, so much of coalition building, so much of intersectionality, so much of all of that is, can I see that my struggle is reflected in someone else's struggle? Not in oppression Olympics, not to say one of us is worse than the other. And sometimes one group might need support more than the other, and that's a fair conversation. But still, to be able to say, you're getting attacked in a way that I see, you're hurting in a way that I've been hurt, and how can that build a bridge between us? Even if it's just, I'm not going to listen to the propaganda about you because they tell propaganda about me too.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And I think it is very easy to see ways in which people are different from you, or in this case,
Mm-hmm.
again, two very radically different communities that came together. And it is much harder to see the things that you have in common. And so at the very beginning of the movie and of the movement, you have Mark Ashton saying, they are just like us. They're being beaten up like cops like we are. Thatcher's going after them like she's going after us. We have that in common. And it's actually harder from the other side, for the miners to see that, but many of them do eventually. And I think many of the miners are uncomfortable with
Mm-hmm.
queer people, and that's just the fact of how those people felt. And
Yeah.
we can critique that, but that is the fact of how people felt. It is unfortunately how some people still feel. But I do think that there is power in seeing, even if I am uncomfortable with some of what you have said, or even if I am uncomfortable with some aspects of how you live, we can still see this is an existential threat and we
Yeah.
need to be united against it. and find that common ground. And I think that that, again, is very powerful. And I also think it is powerful and important that a lot of the miners ended up seeing, oh, we do have a lot in common, and also, yeah, you are just people, and feeling more comfortable with it. And that is certainly part of the narrative of the movie. And
Definitely.
that's a really beautiful thing.
Yeah. And I think they tell it really well, especially in that while they are two very different groups, as the movie goes on, we find that there are ways they overlap. There is one of the miners is himself gay, and that's a part of where he's coming from. One of the leaders of the gay movement is from a mining town in Wales. And I think it's never quite said if his parents themselves are miners, but clearly like he's from the community that this is all happening in. And I really love the efforts that are clearly made, and the stumbles. Like
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that they show is that the two kind of main leaders of the things are Mark, who we've talked about, and Di, who is the leader of the. He's not the union leader, but he's the union spokesman. So he's the one who comes down from the town to come and meet with them and stuff like that. And he gets asked to go to this gay and lesbian bar to speak about what's happening, and everyone expects him to completely bomb, and he does great. It is such like, if you ever want a lesson in how to speak to a community that assumes you're going to be hostile in a disarming kind of a way, watch his speech because it is so well done. And then on the flip side, Mark, who I think is just this powerhouse of organizing, he goes into the miners hall, the welfare hall, and shits the bed, pretty honestly. Like he knows they're uncomfortable, and he kind of reverts to, kind of like teasing them about like, well, I'm sure many more you are gay, which probably there's some truth to, but like this is not how you build that bridge. And I just kind of love that, because I think it would have been easy for this movie to be the smart, sophisticated city folk go and help the dumb, backwards country folk so that they all can be together. And it's not that. It really shows like I think the lessons that had to be learned on both sides in a
Yeah,
lot of ways.
definitely.
Let's talk more about the HIV/AIDS part of it. And this is something I know is important to you, because I don't know if you still do, but I know for a number of years you worked for one of the big coalitions groups that's working against, working for like AIDS education and advocacy. Am I correct?
Yes, I have not I ended up leaving that job 5 or 6 years ago now, but for more than a decade, it was a community news organization, and I
Mm-hmm.
worked on the website, so I was not the person going to conferences and doing the interviews necessarily, but I definitely was pretty enmeshed in that community, and it's something that was very important to me. It still is. The site is thebody.com. It's great. People should look at it for HIV news and awareness. Um, but yeah, so that was something that was very much on my mind going into this, and I was curious how the movie was going to address it. I knew the basics of what had happened before, but I didn't know who the players in the story were. And
Right.
I had been going into it thinking this is a story that is centering around, several gay men in the mid 80s.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something that would be part of their lives. I wasn't sure which, I say characters, some are characters, some are actual people who are
Yeah.
being, turned into characters for a movie. I wasn't sure if they were going to get into whether or not any of them had diagnoses, and they did. And as I said before, I was really pleased with the balance that the movie struck with that. You do find out one of the characters is HIV positive. He's a long-term survivor. He's still alive, even though he was one of the very first people in the
Yeah.
UK diagnosed in the very early 80s.
Literally
Um,
number 2, Jonathan Blake.
yes,
And
yes.
in the movie 2011, he was still alive. He was 65 at that point. I kind of wondered, like, I mean, he's just a man in his 70s, late, almost 80s. Is he still alive? He is still alive today.
Yes, that was one of the very first. I finished the movie and then I checked Wikipedia immediately.
Yeah.
Whereas Mark Ashton passed away only a couple years after the movie, and the movie doesn't explicitly tell you that he is living with HIV or that he is, being tested for it or looking for it. But there is a really powerful scene, which is something certainly I had the context for, and I hope most viewers would, although I don't know if you are not as familiar with the history of
Mm-hmm.
HIV, if it would be as clear, where he is in a club and he runs into somebody who I think is an ex, but it's not entirely clear, who says, "Oh, I'm on my goodbye tour." And he says, "Where are you going?" And there's not really an answer to that. And
Right.
that to me was very, very clear what that discussion was about. And I
Yeah.
found that to be a very powerful moment. Again, I keep saying that word, but I do mean it,
Right.
because it made it very clear. After that, Mark has a little bit of a breakdown. And that's also when the things are going wrong with the group and the strike is not being successful. And he ends up sort of freaking out and leaving for a while.
Right.
And I think that understanding that moment gives it context that he's got a lot more going on than just this movement that is very important to him,
Yeah.
although that is a huge part of it. But I found not naming it in that moment to also be something that was very powerful and that spoke to this was just a thing that people knew and it didn't
Yeah.
always have to be said, but it was something that was a huge and terrifying part of these people's lives.
No, I fully agree. And I definitely picked up on it. And I think if you're of kind of older Gen X or younger older millennial Gen X or above, you probably pick up on it as well. I think for younger people, it may be something that needs to be a bit of explaining, in part because like HIV/AIDS is still an incredibly deadly disease. If you're not getting the treatment and care that you need, that treatment care is by no means accessible to everyone. Even with that, it can sometimes still be deadly. But I think among a lot of people today, there's a perception of HIV/AIDS is now something you can live with if you're doing all the medical stuff that you need to do, et cetera, et cetera. And please correct me if any point I'm
Oh
wrong.
no, I what I would add to that is that it is increasingly easy to live with if you have access to medical care. There
Right.
was when I was in high school, certainly, and probably when you were as well, there was a lot of discussion of like the cocktail drugs, and you would have to take 5 drugs at a time at very specific, like every 5 hours around the clock.
Yeah.
And that's not the case anymore. Most people are able to have one pill a day, and are fine and have the same rough health outcomes as people who are not living with HIV.
Right.
There are also a lot of different forms of prevention now. Certainly, again, when we were younger, it was basically, condoms and abstinence, and you were
Right.
lucky if in school you got condoms as part of the discussion instead of just abstinence. But now you do have PrEP, and there are different forms of PrEP that are being approved of,
Mm-hmm.
and it is certainly it is a very, very different outcome possible today,
Right.
which is incredible. Medical science is amazing and should be funded,
Yeah.
and that should be the end of that
Yeah.
sentence. Um,
100%. And thank you, Jeff, for jumping more in there. And you're right. I think like I'm a little older than you, but we're close. And I was those things were just getting started, but there was still very much the perception, especially when I was younger, HIV is a death sentence. And certainly at the time of the early 80s, when this movie is taking place, I think it's 84, that was very much the case. None of those things were around at the time. And not only that, but there was still so much stigma and so much fear about it. Like at one point, a character says she doesn't want any of these gay visitors to their town sleeping in her basement because she might get AIDS. That kind of massive ignorance and things like that. And I think you're right that in some ways, if that character had said to Mark, "Yeah, I just got my positive test" or something like that, it would have felt very inauthentic because there's absolutely no need to have that conversation. It was so clear in that world. Of course, that's what it would mean. And I think they have a helpful way where Jonathan later is talking to Sean, one of the straight characters from Wales. And so because she doesn't have that context, he tells her more about what's happening. And that I thought was a really brilliant way of storytelling of that. Like that to me was a setting where him kind of giving a little bit of exposition about what AIDS is like at that time made a lot of sense in a way that if it was Mark and that, I think it's, an ex or somebody hooked up with, somebody who was part of that scene with, would not have made sense.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's it's important to name that. And I think, there was a time when if you were making a gay movie, there had to be a character who suffered a gay bashing and there had to be a character who died of AIDS. And there was a real push to sort of, in kind of the same way of like, yes, we should tell movies about racism, but not every Black character has to be a victim of racism as part of every movie. I think there's been a big movement more recently to be like, queer joy is important.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to have those moments. Trigger warning, both of those things happen. There was a gay bashing incident. HIV is obviously a big thing, but it being a part of the history of this movie, I think, as you said, makes it's a necessary thing.
Yeah, and they are both things that I think are handled with care.
Yeah,
And a lot of thought is put into how they are portrayed and how you see them affect people.
yeah,
And we find out that Jonathan is HIV positive when his partner is the one who has been hospitalized in a gay bashing and is
yeah,
trying to tell people, oh no, you have to take care of him, make sure he's eating his vegetables. He has HIV. It's really important that he stay healthy. And
right.
is clearly trying to is clearly struggling with what has happened to him and is doing what he can to try and protect someone else. And that, I mean, that's also a very moving moment that is very
Yeah,
well done.
very much. Yeah, because Sean at first is down there kind of mothering him and being like, no, no, we're worried about you. And that's when he has to say, no, it's this. And then Jonathan tells that incredible story of him being literally the second person diagnosed and still alive, which it did happen, but is, I would bet that he's number two. I'm betting the first 1,000, there's very, very few who are still alive
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
And he's having that conversation with another one of my favorite characters in this, who I think has another incredible journey, Sean James. Talk a bit about what you thought of her journey.
I loved her journey. And she was somebody else who I looked up, and I think and there's a postscript about her in the sort of over the closing credits.
Mm-hmm.
She starts out as a wife and mother who is helping make sandwiches for supporting the miners, and her husband is a miner, and she is not really in a leadership role or anything. She kind of wants to be, but she seems really intimidated by it. And then in the first meeting, the first meeting that we see, she is making sandwiches and listening to the people who are the leadership committee discuss whether or not they should invite the gays and lesbians who have been donating money to come visit their town,
Right.
which all of the other groups that have donated they have invited. And she finally just says, well, just if you've invited everybody else, just invite them. And she makes herself more of a presence. And her husband is a little bit uncomfortable with that because he's very uncomfortable with the idea of gay people, which he does through the course of the movie. He gets to know people, he moves
Yep.
past that, he becomes very defensive of them when other people are threatening and rude, which is, I thought, I don't love violence, but I do actually love the moment when he grabs like the two young idiots who are being very disrespectful and bodily shoves them out of
Yeah.
the room. Like, I thought that was great. But she very much comes into herself. She becomes a leader. She becomes a caretaker, as was mentioned, for sort of the point of view character of the movie, who is a fictional character,
Yep.
as well as the guy in the hospital and his partner. And she is somebody who becomes very involved with this group. They clearly mean a lot to her. She's very accepting. And at the end, I think it's Jonathan maybe encourages her, why don't you
Yep.
go to college? You have such a great mind and you're such a good leader. And what's wonderful is that she actually, in real life, she did. And she eventually, I believe, became a member of parliament. And that
Yep.
is so cool. And that is something that happened because during this strike and during this alliance and coalition that they built, she was somebody who was able to become a leader. And that is so cool. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
It's such a wonderful story, and she's the first woman ever elected in her district. I think she's retired now, but she did serve for quite a while. And it is such a wonderful part of the story. And first, not to go back a bit, but it's one of the ways in which the HIV story helps to set context for everything else. Because part of what he's saying to her is, like, he's talking about how many wonderful people of his generation and the younger generations have these incredible minds and are no longer here. And he basically says, like, you have this great mind, don't waste it, because so many people are not getting their chance and they need people like you to advocate and to fight for. And I know she did quite a lot in Parliament on a number of issues, especially minors' rights and union rights. But also, I know she did quite a lot of fighting for, HIV care and AIDS care and stuff like that. And I have to imagine that's very connected to that part of the story. And yeah, it's a kind of moment where you need this to be based on a true story, because if this was a completely, if one of the kids at the end of Newsies grows up and goes to run for Congress because he got so inspired, you're like, come on, Disney, like, that's so clean, that's so silly. And so when I saw it really happen, I was like, me and my partner were both like, wait, really? We had to Google it because it just felt so ridiculous. But yeah,
But
but
it's wonderful.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Not ridiculous in like a not believable way, but in a just like it is just such a perfect story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this really is a story that lends itself to being a movie. The things that
Yeah.
actually happened work so well narratively, and I'm sure that they did not all happen exactly as we saw in the movie, but this coalition was real. The Pits and Perverts fundraiser club night was real, and it was their
Yep.
biggest fundraiser. And that did come after that was what a newspaper had dismissively referred to them as. And they embraced that and used that for fundraising. Mark Ashton was a real person, Jonathan was a real person, Sean was a real person. Like it, and then she went on to be a politician. It really is just like, wow, history told a story here,
Yeah.
and it's
Well,
good that it was remembered and turned into this movie.
and in my mind, it's also such a brilliant moment of community organizing because that's a very sort of maligned profession these days. But one of the biggest things about community organizing, like when I was being taught how to do it, and in that work, and then when I taught others, a phrase we often use is organize yourself out of a job. Like if you are someone who is helping a community from the outside, part of your job is to help find the people who should be leaders in that community and lift them up and give them the skills and the training and the encouragement so they can then do it themselves, and you're not needed anymore. And so the fact that that's what happened with her, that this community coming in to help from the outside and giving them motivation to fight and to speak, gives her this. And that she, like, one of the things that happens is because they've been dealing with the police a lot longer, like they know the rules about when you can arrest people at a protest and when you can't. And so, but they know that like two gay men walking into a police station in like South Wales is not going to be helpful. So they teach her how to speak, and she uses her voice to go and speak for people.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good.
Yeah. One part of the movie that's not as accurate as it could be. I'm curious what you think about it, because I think one of the things that makes the movie very comedic is it plays on kind of a cliche, but I think one that can be very easily used, which is kind of the friendship between younger gay men and older women. And there's a lot of kind of funny fish out of water stuff, and some women of all ages, and like a lot of little girls who are just so fascinated with this guy Jeff and his incredible hair, and all the women dance, but none of the straight guys will dance, and so the women, the gay men will dance with them. There's one great moment where a woman who's a housewife and kind of clearly is unsatisfied with that role in life says to one couple, like, I need to ask you a question. And they are so convinced she's about to ask them about sex. And she says, which one of you does the housekeeping? And I just thought that was such an interesting moment of like how we see gender and gender roles, and her assuming like, well, she's never known anything except those gender roles. So two men, one of them still must be like, the housekeeper, and the other's the breadwinner. But that part of the movie isn't the most accurate. But those moments I'm sure happened, but in the movie, it is mostly gay men. There's one lesbian who is kind of portrayed very well, Steph, and then a couple of others who are there a little bit more for comic relief because they're vegans and they're always sort of wanting to do their own committees and stuff like that, and they're not really as much of a part of things. And my understanding is that there was a little bit of tension in that regard, but that the group itself was actually much more gender balanced, and there were a lot more lesbians who were much more involved. And so I kind of look at that, and I'm like, on the one hand, like it feels like I wish it was a little more accurate because these things matter. I also, though, I can look at it and understand, like, for the uplifting comedic beats they were going for, I understood why they did that. I'm kind of curious, what's your take on that in terms of a like because I feel like it does come across a little bit more like, hey, it's the gay man who did this, that I really I would have liked it was a little bit more balanced, but I'm curious your thoughts on it.
I think a little bit more balance would have been nice. I also think so. There was apparently a lesbian sort of breakaway group that was specific for women's issues, and I do think
Yeah,
that the movie plays that very much for laughs. And I don't know enough about the real history to know did
right.
they like to know what led to that breaking away and what specific concerns they were addressing. And it's
Right.
something which the movie kind of plays as like they don't need a women's specific group, and
Yeah.
genuinely maybe they did, and I don't know enough to know. And that did irk me a little bit, the feeling of like the specific like those two lesbian characters who then break away were very much
Hmm.
played as like kind of everybody rolls their eyes at them,
Right.
and that when the overwhelming majority of the rest of the queer characters are men, felt a little bit unbalanced.
Yeah.
In terms of things like the dancing, I thought that, probably not accurate, but I did think it was lovely.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned earlier, like Mark goes to give his speech and he bombs, and then what actually starts to get through to people is dancing and celebrating and sort of having like moments of freedom of expression. And
Yeah.
then that does pull in the women, and then there are a couple of men who had been very hesitant but who are literally like, oh, it's a cliche, but they're like, oh, if I try to dance, girls might like me. And so they decide to ask, one of the gay men to teach them to dance. And it's very
Yeah.
silly and very cliche, but it is like the
It,
heartwarming. Like
yeah.
it's
It's
fun, it feels good, and it gives you sort of what the narrative needs you to understand, which is that these two groups do eventually start to mesh and
yeah.
open up to each other and have each other's backs in that way. And so I am sure that is not how it actually happened, but I
Yeah.
feel like narratively that worked well, but I do wish there had been more balance. And I did love Steph. I thought she was like the coolest girl in the world
Yeah.
watching that. I was like, oh, she's amazing and I love her.
Steph is fantastic, and as you mentioned, the main POV character is this young man who's just coming out at the start of the movie and kind of goes through his growth. His name is Joe. He's from a town called Bentley. He's a fictionalized character, but I think it really works for the movie. But he has this really wonderful friendship with Steph, and at one point,
Yeah.
when he comes out and leaves his family, he goes to move in with her, and they have this really beautiful heart to heart as they're lying together in bed because they're poor and they have one mattress to share. And she sort of looks at him and goes, if we were normal, we would kiss right now. And then they both laugh it off. And it was just this really beautiful moment of, I think, again, a really important, like, not to keep going back to the AIDS part of it, but like one of the things that happened in the AIDS, a lot of the unity of gay and lesbian happened in part because gay male groups that had often not really been very interested in working with lesbian groups started realizing, like, when they were dying of AIDS, it was lesbians who were the only ones who were willing to come and help and take care of them.
Mm-hmm.
And that fueled a lot of the kind of coalition stuff. And so this moment of, they're not sexually interested in each other, they're not romantically interested in each other, but it's such clear found family moment of these two people who've been rejected by their families finding a family with each other. It was just such a beautiful moment to me.
Absolutely. I was actually thinking that too. It's very much, it is another form of solidarity between gay men and gay women. And the movie didn't show that very often because,
Yeah.
again, there were not that many queer women who were represented in the movie. But it did have that moment, which I think, again, same word I keep using, but it is very powerful and it is
Yeah.
very lovely.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned the two minors who, they kind of figure out, like, okay, I don't really, that's not about how I feel about gay guys, but like the way they dance attracts women's attention. And this, it's kind of a proto, like, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy starts in this wet mining town. And you can kind of roll your eyes at it a little bit. But I kind of loved it in part because it also is a reminder of, coalition building doesn't always have to be for the purest, most wonderful ideals, because clearly it is a moment of, they see, like, oh, I can get laid more if I do this. This is a thing I should do. But also it is the moment that lets them sort of break down and become more friendly and get to know people more. And because one of them was like, I'll buy a guy a pint, but then I'm going to stay on the other side of the room. And he's not that, by the end of the movie.
I think bringing up Queer Eye for the Straight Guy is really sort of fun in this context because fun might not be the right word, because that the first version of that came out 20 years later, but it actually was almost exactly that conversation. I remember when it came out, me being in college and very progressive, I was like, ugh, this is all stereotypes. And then I had friends who pointed out to me, like, yes, but also it's straight men being told, here is value in the things that queer men do and can do for you and ways that you should be more like them. And that's not really something that had been seen or discussed before. And so I do think that moment is very Queer Eye in that specific way, but that's, again, what those characters needed and that time, like what the narrative needed to convey in that time.
Right. Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I had no idea where I want to go with this and then completely left my mind. What are other elements that really kind of hit you or that you wanted to bring up?
So I mentioned in the intro respectability politics, and I think that there are sort of two pieces of that I wanted to touch on, because one is sort of trying to have some empathy for some of the terrible people in this mining town who do not learn the error of their ways, who do not become comfortable with queer people at any point, but did feel what I took to be genuinely having so much publicity around, gays and lesbians supporting the minors would make that their movement look bad and not be taken as seriously. And I do think that's worth discussing. But
Yeah.
the other one was one that I ran into as a criticism of the movie, which is that Mark Ashton was actually a communist.
Yeah.
He was a member of the Communist Party. He was a leader of the Young Communist Party. That was something that he cared deeply about, and that was part of his motivation for seeking this solidarity. And that is not something the movie engages with at all. At some point, somebody yells "commie" at him, and that's the
Yeah.
closest that they get to ever acknowledging that. And I did wonder if the movie was also sort of engaging in respectability politics there by not
Yeah.
bringing that up.
I think that's probably true. I will say there's one other moment that points to it, but that I missed the first time I saw the movie, which is that early in the movie, when, and granted, this is not showing Mark at his best. Like, your introduction to Mark is when clearly he's had a hookup, someone who has stayed over the night before. He's watching news about the miners' strike, and the guy is like, "I left my number just in case," and Mark kind of barely acknowledges him. But you're seeing part of Mark's like kitchen, and there is a big communist flag. Like, there is the flag of the Soviet Union. But I don't think I noticed it the first time I saw it.
Yeah,
And
I
you're
missed
right.
that. So
Yeah. So it's like, it's pointed out, and I think you're right. The respectability politics there is definitely a thing. And with respect to, and I think there's one other element that I would add to it also is that originally one of the conflicts that Jonathan has, and he's one of sort of the older gays in the movie compared to Mark and some of the others, is he talks a lot about like he likes being flamboyant and he likes being like openly, proudly queer. I don't know if you would use that word, but I think like we would look at it that in that kind of language today. And at one point, there's discussion among some of the others, including some of the others who are very clearly of the like, we want the white picket fence and 2.3 kids and a dog. We just want it with two men instead of a man and a woman. And they kind of say like, do we need to be so flamboyant? Because again, they're trying to be very, we want the minors to like us. We don't want to scare them off. And he calls them out and he says, "I'm sorry, I haven't spoken 1950s in a while." And I thought that was just such an interesting thing of like, with both of these groups, there's that sense of how do we work with others, and like, how much do you, I'm gonna get really into queer theory here, but have you read much Judith Butler?
I have not. I am mildly familiar with some of it, but I have not done the reading myself.
So that's probably the best way to do it, because she is one of the best theorists and one of the worst writers that I've ever read. You just have like, there's sentences that go on for pages. She does not understand periods and commas. But one of her ideas was that kind of like that we're all in drag all the time, that all of gender is a drag, and we're always, you go to a bank and to get a loan, you want them to see you in a certain way and you perform a certain kind of appearance. And you go to a party and you want to be seen a certain way, you perform, and often that is like a different kind of masculinity or femininity or something else. And to me, that's very much a part of this movie, of the like, yeah, on the one hand, it does make sense that if you're going to get a group where there's a lot of kids hanging out, maybe you don't have a whole bunch of like curse words on your signs, but also how far does that go? And I appreciate that it does show the cost to some extent of the minors who are concerned, that they have reason to, that there is, once this story comes out, a lot of people lose respect for them and they're getting teased about it constantly. And I think there's a message of like, you shouldn't let that get to you, but these are people who've been on strike for 10 months and they're fighting the cops every day. And so I appreciate that. I think it does come down on the side of like, the respectability politics is not the way to go, but also not making it just a joke, not showing that like there was a real cost here paid on all sides of how diplomatic do you be and how diplomatic do you not be.
Exactly, which I thought was really interesting, and I was glad they included that because, again, Maureen, the very homophobic character, is not portrayed as somebody who is a good person at all, and nor should she particularly be. But I do think that question of how much is just homophobia, which a lot of it is, but
Yep.
how much of it is also understanding that being seen in that way will make them be taken less seriously and will hurt their movement. And
Yeah.
ultimately, like you said, I think the movie, I think correctly, comes down very much on the side of the coalition is more important, building alliances is more important, and also don't be homophobic. It's okay to be friends with gay people.
Yeah.
but I think that it is important that that was acknowledged, because that was a real thing. It wasn't just, oh, these people are homophobic, but the rest of the world is fine. It was, these people were homophobic within a homophobic society that was not going to take them seriously if they were seen being supported by gay people. And sure enough, there was the actual article that was written that actually happened. That was like a hugely damaging to
Yeah.
the way they were perceived.
And I think one thing that also came to me in that is an important lesson of, like, when you are a group that is being oppressed, like, clearly the message of this is the best thing you can do is to find common ground with others who are oppressed, but also that there is a natural pressure to turn very insular and to not want to get involved with others, And I think anti-minor bias and, like, kind of city bias towards the working class and stuff like that, I don't think it to me is not the same level as homophobia, especially as it portrayed in this movie, nor do I think it should be. But there is some sign, like, there are a couple times when the guys are out canvassing for lesbians and gays support the minors, and other gay people could get really mad at them and say, like, look, we're dying of AIDS. Why are you supporting them? Or, like, folks who say, like, these are the people who beat me up. Why would I support them? And it's not the same, but to me, there feels something like Maureen to me feels like someone who's been kicked and oppressed and so just wants to fight off anything except fighting for her group. And I saw a connection between that and what those guys who, were like, look, we gay people are suffering. Why would we get involved with this group and, hundreds of miles away?
Yeah, which I think is a very real feeling. Like, I grew up in a very rural town, and I have very complicated feelings about rural areas.
Yeah.
And the ways in which they are not utopias. There are certainly some rural areas that are still quite homophobic or still quite racist, but it's also, I think, incorrect to portray all rural areas or all rural people that way. And it always has been. And I do think that in the city, there can often be a sort of a knee-jerk assumption of, redneckness about rural people.
Oh, yeah.
And that, that is still very much a thing. I also think that when you are in a rural town and that is where you grew up, there are a lot of knee-jerk assumptions made about people who live in cities. And those things are also not very kind. And none of these are accurate. But I do very much, being me, it is much easier to empathize with the gay man who says those are the people who beat me up, as opposed to the homophobic woman who says, I can't deal with this. I need us to be taken seriously. But again, I am a queer person. Like, of course, that's going to be my bias. And I do think that's why, it's important that the movie frames it from the very beginning of, as Mark saying, they get beat up just like we do. The cops are after them just like they're after us. Thatcher's after them just like they're after us, and starts literally, like, among the first dialogue is him listing everything that they have in common. And I think that's very important for framing it for the viewer, so that the viewer understands that even though some of those lenses that other people have may be technically correct for that person, that they are not the most important way to view this.
Yeah. And I think part of what it shows is that with a lot of the characters, especially the ones who kind of come around, it really feels like it's not coming from a place of hate, it's coming from a place of ignorance. Because again, it's like it is hard to develop an affinity for a group when everyone around you is constantly telling you only the worst propaganda about that group. And that goes both ways. I most definitely had a lot of pretty terrible attitudes towards people in the flyover states, towards people who live, I used to think people who lived in Brooklyn were troglodytes, because I lived in Manhattan and that was the only part of the real city.
That's Spock Conlon's territory.
I was the 80s. It was the 80s. I still have bad feelings about Northern New Jersey, but never putting that aside.
That's different.
But yeah, I think that sense, and so much of this is about is like, you can have your idea of a gay person is like this, a lesbian is like this, and then you meet that person. And one of my favorite characters in the movie is Helena, I think that's her name. She's not Helena, but like one of the oldest of the women, clearly comes in with some very, kind of nutty stereotypes. And she wants to ask about them, and everyone's like, no, shut up, please don't embarrass us. But it's so clear that she's asking from a place of like genuine curiosity. Like if you know that Ted Lasso line
Mhm.
about it's a Walt Whitman quote, be curious, not judgmental. When she says to the lesbians, like, are are you all vegetarians? Like, I could see a lot of people being pretty offended by that, and I could get it, but like, it's so clear that she's just like, oh, what a fascinating new community. I want to know. And
Mhm.
to me, at the end of the day, I don't. There was a while ago, I was having dinner at a friend's house and with their parents, and we got talking about Trump and things like that. And the father, who was very blue collar and clearly like that had been his life, all of his life, made a comment just out of the blue about like, yeah, he can't stand Trump because among other things, he hates what Trump is doing to the transvestites and like, why, all these attacks and like the use of that word to respond to the transgender community, I think is often seen as like very outdated and kind of almost a slur. That's the word he knew because that's what he'd been told, but he clearly meant it in such a like, I hate this community being attacked, I want to support this community. And I think that's what I think of a lot when I see like, the people in the mining community and the people in the London community being ignorant and almost a little, problematic towards the other, but it comes from this place of ignorance, not of severe dislike.
Well, and I do think that that's also, present day politics, part of why a lot of very conservative Republicans hate higher education and
Yeah.
are trying to destroy it. And they keep talking about liberal colleges, liberal college bias, et cetera, et cetera. But what it actually is that people who go to college meet people who are unlike them at college. They meet people, straight people meet queer people, white people meet people of color. And if you've grown up in an insular community, you may never have had that experience before. Again, from a very rural town, I knew like one black person growing up until I went to college. Honestly,
Yeah.
I went to a pretty white college too. So, really, until I moved to New York, like it exposes you to people who you would not necessarily meet in your home community. And that makes those people real, and it makes it much easier to empathize with them and to understand that's not a scary threat. That's just my friend. Or not
Yeah.
even necessarily my friend. That's not a scary threat. That's just the person who lives at the end of my dorm hall. Like, and it becomes that much harder to demonize groups if you're like, well, yeah, but my friend John is black and he's not all of the horrible stereotypes you're listing, so I kind of
Yeah.
know that you're full of shit.
Yeah.
Sorry, forgot I wasn't supposed to swear.
Oh no,
Um,
we swear now on this podcast. It's fine.
oh, okay. And that's, I think very much also the experience of the both communities, but I would say particularly the rural community in here, but definitely both,
Yeah.
is, oh, now I know some gay people and I can see that they're not whatever the propaganda has been telling me they are. They're kind of just people and they're trying to help with this thing that I care about. So that's actually great and we should be friends.
Yeah. And just so people don't think this is like some crazy new liberal idea, George Washington in his farewell address talked about the need for a national university, in part because, at that point he thought of this, we were 13 colonies that all had a lot of regional prejudices against each other. And he wanted the youth of the country to come together and meet and move past those prejudices. So that's always been a thing. I've had you almost an hour. I want to wrap up. So I wanted to close with, there are two moments in this movie that always make me cry. One is the ending, but the other is when the gays the lesbian gay group that has come up has made this really powerful statement about how they have to do more, and they're in the sort of welfare. And a couple of the women, starting with the wife of Di, the kind of community leader on the minor side, start singing a song called "Bread and Roses." And the women all join in, and then the guys join it. Yeah, and if you watch this
And
on
I
YouTube, you can
cry
see
and
both of
you
us.
cry and everybody
It's
watching cries.
it's incredible. And I just do you know the history of that song and the relevance of that particular song?
I I don't know the history of it. I've certainly picked up the relevance from context.
Yeah. So it was written in 1912 by hold on. The so sorry. So the concept of it, the idea of fighting for bread and roses, because the song is all about how we fight for bread, but we also fight for roses. Like that life should be not just about survival, but about dignity and about beauty, and that we should all have the right to have these things in life. And it started with a woman named Helen Todd, who was a woman suffragette. and also was connected to the 1912 Lawrence textile strike in Massachusetts, which was a strike of women workers. And the song quickly became a real favorite of the labor movement, especially ones in which women were involved. It became very popular during the Spanish Civil War among the Republicans and the pro-labor movements, and the communists and the socialists and all of them. And it is just this, it kind of makes me want to have learned more about what were those women's issues, because the movie barely talks about this, because the miners are the ones who are on strike. And those are, I'm sure that somewhere in the United Kingdom, there was a couple of non-men who were miners and were on strike, but it is overwhelmingly men's work. But clearly you see that like the women are suffering just as much. They're trying to hold these households together with less and less money coming in. And a lot of them are dealing with, one of them has a drunk husband who's always kind of treating her badly. And she has this idea that sex is something she's just supposed to put up with. And to me, the song and it being sung by the women is a very important kind of statement of how the men are the ones who are supposed to be working and are not because they're on strike, but this is affecting the entire community. It's affecting all of them. And that they're not just fighting for more money. They're fighting to be for the same thing, like literally the word pride. That's what they're fighting for. The song is about wanting to be treated with dignity, with pride and with respect.
It's a very, very powerful moment, to say powerful again, but it truly is. It definitely made me cry. It is beautiful, and it certainly also, I think, drives home the solidarity again between, like, we mentioned gay women and lesbians earlier, or gay men and lesbians earlier, but also between these women in the community who, as you said, they're not likely to be the actual minors, but they are still deeply affected by this. It's their, their household, their husbands, their sons. One of the characters, his brother had died in a mine, and it turns out that that brother was the husband of Maureen, the horrible homophobe.
Mm-hmm.
But you see the way that the women are standing together and very much the backbone of the community, at least as much as the men who are actually striking are. And it
Yeah.
is extremely important, and it's just extremely beautiful. It
Yeah.
really is.
There's a wonderful version of it by Judy Collins that was recorded in 1976 that you can find easily on Spotify and things like that. But also, if you just search on YouTube, Bread and Roses Pride 2011, you'll find a clip of that song. And it is just the way they instrumentalize it and produce it and all that is incredible. Also, something I just was Googling
It's
it
sorry, it's
quickly.
2014, not 2011.
Oh, I don't know. I keep saying 2014. Okay. But one thing is also, if you, what I just learned Googling the song now, one of the more recent performances of it that drew a lot of attention was it was performed at the inauguration of Zoran Mandani, the mayor of New York City.
Yeah.
So just
I had forgotten that, but I sure was watching that.
yeah, yeah. So, well, Becky, I'm so glad you were part of this conversation. Is there any other last things you wanted to touch on or moments of the movie you want to comment on?
I think we covered it. It's definitely a movie that I would be happy to watch again, and I'm sure I would pick up on much more, like the communist flag being in his
Yeah,
apartment, which I did not the first time because I wasn't familiar with it yet. Yeah, it's definitely it's worth a watch, especially in June for Pride, but probably at any point. It's
yeah,
definitely worth a watch if you are feeling overwhelmed, I think, by some of the news. As a reminder, as I said at the beginning, that history doesn't stop. You can still build coalitions. You can, even if you lose a fight, that doesn't mean that you have lost. And you can still build, and you can still love people and help people.
yeah, 100%. And that sometimes, reaching out. I'm gonna comment on that. I'm gonna bring up one last thing that I remembered I wanted to touch on just because we were talking about before, when you were talking about how even when some of the people in the mining town are not the most welcoming to the gays, but that Mark and the others are still like, but they still need our help. Um, that to me is an argument that continues to ring true to me. The two times I think of it most recently is when queer people have come together to support Palestine and Gaza, and also when there was that horrible flood that killed so many children in a admittedly very conservative Christian community and school. there were people who were saying, like, why would you support them? They hate you. Why would you support, and I think there's a lot of pink washing, and the idea that Israel is this gay paradise is not accurate, and the idea that all of Palestinians in Gaza are homophobic is not accurate. But I think also, I remember the concept of, I I don't care how they vote. I don't want them to die because of government failure. I'm going to support someone else's rights. And I hope that what happens in this movie happens, that my supporting their rights makes them think I'm not the terrible person that their parents have told me. But even if it doesn't, if the government's oppressing them, I don't want that to happen any more than I want it to happen to me. And I just love that part of the movie.
Yeah.
Felt irrelevant. So, all right. Well, Becky, thank you so much. For people who want to find you, you are a published author. You're always doing awesome stuff. Where can people find your stuff?
Best place to find me is my website, specifically my newsletter. So that would be at BeckyAllenBooks.com/newsletter, which I send out once a month just to give folks updates on what's going on with my writing. If you are on Blue Sky or Instagram, I am Allreb, ALLREB, on both of those.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely check all that out. Check out Becky's writings, especially. Really great books, really great work. Of course, you can find this podcast and my other podcasts all at theethicalpanda.com. I do the Star Wars podcast. We are also going to do an episode about Pride in the Galaxy Far, Far Away. There have been a number of queer characters in that universe, not just the two people who kiss at the end of Rise of Skywalker, but especially in the books and the video games, but also in the TV shows, some beautiful queer relationships, some wonderful queer characters, a lot of great exploration of both individual characters who are ace or intergender or like non-binary because their whole species is, or because they are individually. A lot of fantastic stuff. I'm excited. We're going to record that episode in a couple days, and hopefully it should be out pretty soon after this one. So on behalf of myself and Becky, thank you all so much for being a part of this. May the force be with you.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride. All right, let me hit end.